All right, folks, welcome back to this series of student interviews that are being run with Knowable World students. Mikaela, you might remember from our series on Chinese history, and she's back to do Japanese history for us. So we're going to dive right in here. And Mikaela, let's get us started where we always should start, which is by setting the context for our expose, for our inquiry here. And that consists of making sure that we know what kind of world it is we're talking about and that we're trying to learn about. Because at Knowable World, history is the revelation and explanation of the world we live in. We don't study topics as fragments. We don't study them separately. We don't study them as if they're just these self-contained stories. Clearly, what many of you are going to see today is that there are a lot of connections, for instance, between Japanese history and Chinese history, Japanese history and European history, Japanese history and American history. So the world we live in is this web of connectivity between cultures. And so that's what we do at Knowable World is we start immediately by saying, the world we live in is. Let's go ahead and set the context, Mikaela.
The world we live in is an interconnected agglomeration of nearly 200 countries that can be broken up into 10 major cultural blocks, 5 of which are cardinal cultures in which the United States has primacy.
Okay, so when we did Chinese history, we immediately identified that China is one of those cardinal cultures, one of those ones that have the will and the way to truly deflect the course of history in our time. Where does Japan stand within that hierarchy of the 200, the 10, the 5, and the one with the primacy? Where is Japan in that picture?
Japan is a major culture, which means that it is significant enough that we have to pay special attention to it and that it has an impact on the world, but it is not a cardinal culture. And a cardinal culture is a culture that has both the will and capability to change the world.
Okay, right. So Japan, therefore, does not, because Japan today is what kind of culture?
Japan is post-imperial, which means it militarily, it has the capability to change the world if it wanted to, but because it is post-imperial and therefore it lacks a defined set of cultural answers, it does not have the will to change the world.
Okay, you said something very interesting there. It does not possess a definite set of cultural answers. Being post something is this framework that we use in Knowable World. We used it in relation to China. We refer to China as being post-Maoist, meaning that China used to have Maoism as a guiding ideology, very intensive and brutal ideology, which failed so miserably that it had to be abandoned by Deng Xiaoping and later rulers. Now, Japan, you're saying, is post-imperial. Clearly, post means after. Okay, imperial. So Japan indeed used to be an imperial culture. We're not going to dive into that right at this very moment, but of course, most people could use perhaps a little bit of a boost with that. When was Japan an imperial culture? How could Americans, for instance, just get their minds wrapped around that idea?
Before and during World War II. Specifically, our anchor fact that we use for that is 1937 to 45, which is World War II in Asia rather than World War II in Europe. And that actually, we use that fact because of Japan. Japan in 1937 invaded China to try and make them part of their empire, therefore beginning World War II, a conflict that would later relate to World War II.
In Asia, right? There you go. It's two conflicts that all wrap up into one because of the alliance of Japan and Germany. Okay, good. So, post-imperial. Let's talk a little bit more about that because Japan today is a culture that does lack a definite set of answers. How can people see that? When most people think of Japan, they think of high tech. Japan is the land of Sony and Lexus and high-speed trains. It's an impressive place. It's got a very high standard of living, very high life expectancy. What could be wrong with that? Actually, that picture perhaps is more complicated. How do we see post-imperialism as a cultural trait in Japan today?
We see it manifesting in Japan's tendency towards insularity, which is meaning that they keep to themselves. They are very apprehensive towards foreigners. They have a very low immigration rate. They have very strict immigration laws, and that is displayed in their shrinking population. In most modern countries today, there's a shrinking population of native people who currently live in them, but that is masked by immigration. Immigration offsets that and keeps these numbers from shrinking. Because Japan has so little immigration, we can see that Japan is already shrinking and has already begun to shrink by a significant amount.
Yeah, somewhere in the order of maybe 10% already in the past 10 years, which is very significant. Literally, if the trend continues, Japan will disappear off the face of the earth. That is not an exaggeration. It's quite a precipitous demographic cliff experience there. And that's because people have babies when they're really expecting good things and they're looking forward to life in the future, and they express that by bringing children into the world. But the Japanese don't have that sense of a future with a purpose. Their post-imperial culture is really adrift. And so that's the way that we see it primarily. We see it in their insularity, as you say, and we see it in their really serious demographic situation. Okay, good. So now we're going to dive into the history. All right, so Mikaela, when does Japanese history begin, and what's it worth to us to know about that kind of stuff?
When it comes to Japanese history, it is a situation very similar to China. It is a very ancient culture, and therefore finding a definite beginning is difficult. So the anchor fact that we use in this case is circa 660 BC, with the birth of Jimmu, who is a figure in Shintoism, which is the religion in Japan. And Jimmu is considered to be divine, as he was seen as the son of the sun goddess Amaterasu.
Right, okay, so circa 660 BC, we have this figure, this semi-legendary figure, Jimmu. And he emerges, and he's the first emperor according to Japanese tradition. And that matters for us in one way, as you said, it's part of Shintoism. And what more? What does the rise of Jimmu, and in China, for instance, we have many dynastic cycles. How is Japan different in that regard? And what premises or beliefs do we see embedded in Japanese culture because of this strange origin point that has such religious significance?
You brought up the idea of the dynastic cycle. In China, there was a ruling family, they rose to power, became corrupt, and fell. Japan does not follow this. Japan, in fact, only had, and still has, one dynasty throughout all two to 3,000 years of its history. And that can be attributed to its unique history. But to understand the cycle of a dynasty, we need to look at and see where it originated. In the case of Jimmu, he began as a charismatic leader. He established his aristocracy in the form of the clans of Japan, and they worked together to gain control and unite, establishing the first period in the cycle of a dynasty, which eventually, in order to remain stable and to live beyond the first charismatic leader, has to turn into a hereditary monarchy.
Okay, absolutely. And continue from there, as we'll discuss a little bit briefly. But the key here is, of course, that, as you mentioned, it's been 2,700 years of one dynasty. Really? That can't be attributed to the practical know-how of the kings, right? Because power corrupts. So why did the Japanese put up with the corrupt power, some of which we'll see examples of as we talk? Why did they put up with that?
The emperor, Jimmu, was considered divine, and therefore all of his future children were considered divine as well.
So in the Western tradition, we refer to that as divine right. It gives the rulers this special, supernatural, all access pass to being in charge, assuming the people really believe in it. And apparently the Japanese do. The seriousness of the Japanese belief in Shintoism is not possible to exaggerate. It's really clear. We'll come back to that maybe in our story of World War II. So Jimmu gets going, and so you get this dynasty. It grinds its way into a stable configuration, as you said, with the clans over time. So what do we need to know about more ancient aspects of Japan, if anything, before we start to get to the stuff that really brings us to modern times?
There are a few things. First, we'll begin with the clans themselves. The clans they helped one another to get into power, of course, but beyond that, they had a tendency to try and grasp for as much power as possible. And therefore, any other clan was a threat to your clan. And this can be seen in the example of the Soga clan. The Soga clan, they wanted to progress the dynastic cycle to a bureaucratic level, which essentially is about creating a system that works independently from the king or independently from any ruler, and is able to just work on its own, and it is comprised of a group of professionals, whether it's a smaller group or a larger group, typically larger group that comprises it.
Yeah, Donald Trump knows something about that. He calls it the deep state. Yeah, or the swamp. Yeah, so Americans know about this bureaucratic government, right? It's professional, it's organized, it's systematic, and to some degree functions regardless of who's in charge. Okay, so it's a rather important innovation in the history of government. The Soga clan wanted to bring it in. Why was that a problem?
The problem was it saw this system happening in China, and with using the values of Confucianism and Buddhism, and decided that it would be valuable to import those. However, given the clan's stance towards one another, they saw this as a threat, because if the Soga clan was leading the charge in establishing this system, it very likely, in their eyes, would give them major control over this system and put their places at risk, which led to the Ishii incident in circa 645 AD, where the other clans murdered the leader of the Soga clan. There are two important components to this. First, the murder of the leader of the Soga clan did not stop the rise of the bureaucratic system. It became a part of Japan anyways, just with the Soga clan gone, but also involved in the Ishii incident. The Empress herself was involved, as in she witnessed the Ishii incident, and afterwards, because in Japanese tradition, the emperor is supposed to be holy, and by witnessing it, therefore, she was polluted, had to step down, and a new emperor took her place, which displays the fact that Japan really valued the purity of their emperor, which later plays into the fact that the emperor or empress could not get involved into the dirtier work involved in ruling a country. They found, instead of the emperor being responsible for doing the dirty work, they found somebody else to do it. They came up with the role of the shogun, who was essentially a military leader, or what would be, in European cases, would be considered the prime minister, who was in charge of managing any rebellions, any wars, anything like that that would involve things that the emperor was considered above doing.
Exactly. Okay, so they had this shogunate, the institution with these various shoguns doing the heavy lifting, the hard work. And that lasted for quite a long time. So like Chinese history, when we study Japan, we don't really need to get too deep into the details of ancient and medieval history. We really find that once we establish the basics, what we need to do in order to keep the information that we're learning relevant to our understanding of the world we live in is figure out, okay, where are, as we call them, the anchor facts of this story, which help bring that story along. And so we have now Jimmu, we have now the Soga clan, we have now the rise of the shoguns. Okay, there's really nothing else. What then brings about the rise of modern Japan? Because clearly there are no shoguns anymore, in case anybody didn't know, right? So therefore something happened. The shogunate failed. What happened?
What ended up happening is, in a word, Europe and European globalization. Japan had limited contact with their neighbors, but when it came to the Europeans and European globalization, they very much had an interest in maintaining relations with any cultures that they came across, especially cultures that had things that they considered valuable, including things that they would use for trade. In the case of Japan, in 1543, there was the arrival of the European merchants. Japan initially was perfectly fine trading. Trading is a win-win type of scenario. So the idea of trading with these people, they had no issues like China, like hubris of believing that they are better than the Europeans. They had a fine relationship. The issue arose in 1549 with the arrival of the European missionaries, the Christian missionaries.
Most famously, this Xavier, and this is a person that has even been sainted by the Catholic Church. Okay, so why was that an issue?
That was an issue because of Japan's entire ruling system was built on the idea of divine monarchy, that the emperor deserved to be in power because he was divine. But in Christianity, there is one God, and bringing that message to the Japanese people that there is only one and that this emperor has no divine right to his throne throws a kind of a wrench into things.
To say the least, right? Because clearly it disqualifies him as a divine being, and so therefore loyalty now becomes an altogether different equation. So how did that play out?
What ended up happening is that the Christian missionaries were successful in converting many Japanese people. The most significant being they were able to convert a clan leader. And this led to an absolute disaster in the Shimabara rebellion. When a leader is converted to a religion, that leader chooses the religion for his people. And this clan leader led a certain area, and all the people there converted to Christianity and rebelled against the emperor, and the emperor couldn't let this stand, so the shogun stepped in, and he massacred all of them.
Yep, something like 30,000 as far as history goes. And when was the Shimabara Rebellion, just for timelining purposes?
1637.
1637. Okay, good. So now, what did Japan do about that? Because clearly Christianity was a threat to the emperor. How did the emperor and the shogun respond?
They responded with the sakoku policy. Sakoku means isolation in Japanese. So rather than them being solely geographically isolated, they turned to very purposeful isolation. Any foreigners who arrived there were instantly beheaded by the samurai.
As long as they showed up, as long as they were allowed to show up in one place, I believe it was Nagasaki. That's it. You could trade there. The merchants were okay. Any other unauthorized foreigner was treated as you said, though, right? The samurai would simply cut their heads off, no questions asked, because of course the Japanese didn't speak their language, so why ask questions? Okay, so brutal, sakoku. All right, how did that go?
That lasted for quite a while, but there is one exception to the sakoku policy, which is Rangaku, which the issue of Sakoku, the reason why it was implemented, was the danger of Christianity to their political system. So that's why they did not want any foreigners. However, there was one type of foreigner that did not have that issue. Those were the Dutch. The Dutch had progressed to a point where they believed in religious toleration, and therefore they did not preach the message of Christianity to the Japanese. And the Japanese were willing to accept them and willing to learn from them, not super significantly, but enough so that they were aware of European technology, rather than China, who during their century of humiliation held on to their belief that they were above and better than the Europeans, refused to learn anything. Versus Japan, this kind of displays that they were a little bit more open towards the rest of the world. The issue just was the danger of their own stability.
Let's make an integration here to European history as well. The Dutch were tolerationists. This was very innovative on their part. And the timing here is quite significant. It's 1543, which is the arrival of the merchants, 1549, the arrival of the missionaries, and 1637, the Shimabara Rebellion. Those are smack dab in the middle of what to make an integration?
The Reformation and religious wars.
Which went from 1517 to 1648. So all of those things are right there in the middle of that terrible episode of Christians slaughtering each other. And so, yeah, that was a time when the Europeans were especially intolerant, including of each other. And so it's understandable the Japanese wouldn't want them around. The Dutch, on the other hand, were tolerationists. So they were permitted. But as you said, it was rather limited, right? Until when?
Up until the Perry expedition / the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1853/4, which were both incidents involving America.
Okay, so Commodore Perry was an American Commodore, and that was his rank, who was sent to Japan to do what?
He was sent to Japan to establish a relationship with them and to ensure the rights of Americans. Specifically, Japan's foreign policy in the eyes of America was unacceptable. There was a danger with American merchants going in that area that possibly one of their ships could have been blown off course, landed on Japan's shore, and suddenly all those Americans, they don't have their heads anymore.
Right.
So they went there to ensure the rights of Americans with using gunboat diplomacy, which essentially is having this huge, it's not specifically having this steamship, but it's in essence pointing at a gun at someone and saying, come talk with me. You better talk with me. Or
yeah, right, because normally diplomacy is very civilized. It's in order to avoid force and the threat of force, which is why gunboat diplomacy is almost a contradiction in terms, right? Because you point the gun and you say, talk. You need to talk or I'm going to shoot. And the Japanese got the message, right? So what happened?
What happened was the Treaty of Kanagawa, which allowed America access to ports and ensured that Americans would not be killed if they showed up on Japan's shores. However, this was not the only treaty that was signed, the other being the Paris Treaty. This was America's first deviation from the Monroe Doctrine, which essentially defined America as trying to remain politically separate and only getting involved with other cultures to maintain the rights of Americans. In the case of the Treaty of Kanagawa, it was primarily to ensure the rights of Americans. When it comes to the Harris Treaty, this was not the case. This treaty imposed extraterritoriality onto Japan, which were American laws that Japan had to follow. These being that Christian churches were allowed in Japan and that Americans were allowed to buy land in Japan, buy and own land in Japan.
Wow, okay, yeah. So as you say, that's probably, in my assessment, based on everything I know, the most significant deviation from the Monroe Doctrine, and America beginning on a career path that's rather dubious and results in a lot of things that I definitely don't approve of. And so becoming the world police power, essentially. So Japan clearly wasn't happy with the Treaty of Kanagawa, 1854, and then the Harris Treaty of 1858. So what did Japan do?
They began to build an empire, which seems contradictory. Japan this entire time has been trying to stay as isolated as possible. Why did they decide to go out and suddenly build an empire? That sounds like the complete opposite. The answer is that they decided to learn from the Europeans, and only from the Europeans. Europeans, they were very well known for their empires. They were a big fan of their empires. And so Japan, seeing that, believed that was the only way to survive in a world like this, that every situation was win-lose. You are either the winners, you are the ones building these empires, or you are losing. You are the ones being conquered by these empires. And in a world like this, the only exception to this rule is America. And America, with the Harris Treaty, made themselves an enemy of Japan. And Japan was not going to learn from America in a situation like that.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, America itself was starting to become a bully, right? So learning from America's story of political separation was going to be a big ask for Japan. They just were not going to be aware of that, process that. And unfortunately, that's one of the reasons why America's entanglement in world politics is always so problematic, because it tends to create situations where the United States is not really loyal to its own values and ends up being hypocritical and coming under fire from the way that it conducts itself. And many times that's justified. So sad for Japan that they learned from Europe and not, let's say, the better version of America. And so they started to build an empire. How did that go?
It was going pretty well for quite a while. They began with Korea. They saw what America did to them, and they did it right back to Korea. They used gunboat diplomacy to force their own ambassadors into Korea's government. And those ambassadors were previously Chinese ambassadors. So they earned the ire of China, which led to the Sino-Japanese War. Both China and Japan fought one another over the fate of Korea, and Japan won. Japan had begun to learn technologically from the rest of the world, where China did not, and so they won. Though at this point, Japan did not take over Korea. That was only after defeating Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904 to 1905.
Sino-Japanese War was 1894 to 95, and now we've got 1904 to 05. So in the period of 10 years, Japan defeated China and then Russia in order to basically dominate the fate of Korea. Okay, and then what?
Japan was able to defeat Russia, who was a European power, like kind of an off-European power, but still right there in Europe, European power, which really showed that they had grown and that they were a threat. After defeating Russia, they took over Korea. The thing about the Japanese Empire is that other European empires, they took over a culture, but they just ruled it, and they used its resources, and sure, they imposed some of their values, but oftentimes it was not enough to completely change the culture. Japan did not have that mindset. Anything that Japan conquered needed to be just another part of Japan in their eyes. So what they did is they tried to completely eliminate Korean culture. They made everyone in Korea speak Japanese. Everything was printed in Japanese. And the most significant out of all of them was that everybody in Korea had to go by a Japanese name. And it was Japan's plan to just keep on conquering, see how large they could get, And next up, they set their sights on China.
Okay, so we got them ruling in Korea. The Korean occupation of Japan was from 1910 to 1945. And as you say, next comes China. So, wow, they really were going to try to gobble up the biggest culture there. And so, yeah, we've arrived now at World War II in Asia. Tell us what we need to know about that.
Japan invaded China. They were planning on expanding their empire as large as they can make it, but they made one fatal mistake. They were worried about what was happening in America. They were worried about Americans coming and stopping them. So they decided to strike first in bombing Pearl Harbor, which brought America into World War II and essentially sealed their fate. America, they were not going to win a war against America. It was long, it was hard, but Japan lost ultimately with the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in which Japan was completely and totally defeated. Because in a world that Japan saw was win-lose, Japan became the losers. And America decided that instead of just punishing them, that they were going to come in and they were going to rebuild Japan into something truly great. They wanted to change Japan. They wanted to build Japan into something different that was not a threat to them anymore, and they wanted to make it benign. They wanted to achieve a Japan that would live in peace rather than turn to war. And that came in the American occupation of Japan from 1945 to 52. Two people in particular had a very significant impact on changing Japan, these being General Douglas MacArthur and William Deming. General Douglas MacArthur, he wrote the new Japanese Constitution. The first thing he did was he separated church and state. The emperor no longer was the one in power. He solely remained as a symbol. And the other thing that he did is he took away Japan's power to wage war. Now, this does not count in self-defense. A pacifist nation cannot exist in a world. If another culture were to go to war against Japan, they have the right to defend themselves, of course. However, they do not have the right to wage war on others. And Japan has kept that promise for 70 years. They have not waged war since, and therefore have earned the right to build a powerful military that is, depending on who you ask, possibly ranked as high as 4th in the world as a self-defense mechanism, specifically in the face of China.
Yeah, so that's the place to end up, right? Because we know that Japan is a post-imperial culture. We know also from our last interview that China is a post-Maoist culture seeking to regain its status as the Middle Kingdom. So how do those things converge in your thoughts about the future of Japan?
Japan and China have had a very rocky relationship in modern history. China was previously the Middle Kingdom, Japan was subordinate, but then Japan grew to power and humiliated China first in the Sino-Japanese War and second in World War II. Japan was horrible to China during World War II. They killed, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of Chinese people. And so therefore, in the eyes of China, Japan is an enemy. And the thing is, though, Japan is also a very close ally to the United States. China cannot go and attack Japan. They cannot get their revenge because of the danger of the United States retaliating against China. Because it's very likely that the United States would go to war over Japan. So now they're in a place where it is very tense between the two of them, with China absolutely despising Japan, but not having the ability to do anything about it, and Japan wanting to remain insular, but still very wary about the threat of China and building their own military in preparation just in case something were to happen. So the two of them are at odds, very tense, but frozen and incapable of really doing anything at this point.
Okay. Yeah. So it leaves Japan in a strange place. On the one hand, you could say there's a quote, happy ending to the story of Japan in the sense that, okay, they suffered a tremendous defeat in World War II, but they bounced back. And thanks to William Deming and the businessmen that helped them rebuild their industries and so on, and the new constitution that was imposed by Douglas MacArthur, now you get this new and benign and generally peaceful and productive contributor to the world order. That's great. But we've got post-imperial culture and it's a malaise. It's not dynamic or purposeful or exciting. And then you've got the threat of China. Yeah, Japan in a way ends on a cliffhanger. The question is, where is this going to go? It doesn't look particularly promising at this time. So it's a major culture, and it's still important in the world. Certainly, we love to buy products from Japan, and Sony, Lexus, whatever, those are wonderful things. And we can be happy that Japan is a peaceful contributor to the world. And we wonder, what's going to happen? Is Japan going to disappear because there just won't be any more Japanese babies? Or is Japan going to come under attack from China? There do seem to be some pretty significant and rather disturbing questions on the horizon. All right, thank you so much, Mikaela, for this second interview. We're going to keep going in this series, that's for sure. Great job. And so those of you here listening, you can see this is what you get from Knowable World.